You are 14 years old. You are standing in a hall filled with 1,000 eyes, breathing air thick with the scent of roasted meats, frankincense, and the sweat of nervous men. You are wearing silk dyed with Tyrian purple, a color worth more than its weight in gold, and jewels that drag at your ears and neck like heavy stones. And the man who is supposed to protect you, your father, the most powerful ruler on earth, has just given your body away with a single drunken sentence. You don't understand at first. You are young, sheltered in the harem, taught that the King of Kings is infallible, a god walking among mortals. You only feel the room freeze. The musicians, playing lyres and flutes from Egypt, stop in the middle of a note. The nobles, men who command armies and govern provinces, stop breathing. Even the torches, flickering against the glazed brick walls of Susa, seem to dim in disbelief. Across the banquet floor, the old general who requested you is smiling. His name is Artabanus. He is a man older than your grandfather, with skin like parchment and eyes that have seen too much death to hold any light. He is smiling because he knows your father cannot refuse, not here, not in front of the entire empire, not when the king's word is law. Your hands begin to shake, hidden within your long sleeves. Your mother, somewhere in the shadows of the women's gallery, covers her face. Every woman in the hall knows exactly what has just happened. Your life is no longer your life. It is a currency. It is a debt paid. And your father, Xerxes the Great, the King of Kings, doesn't look at you. He looks past you. He looks at his reputation, at his pride, at the fragile image of a god-emperor he cannot afford to crack. When he speaks, he uses only one word, a word that falls like a guillotine blade. Granted. Granted. The guests applaud. It is a polite, terrified applause. The general bows low, hiding his triumph. You stand there swallowing a scream that no one will ever hear, because in this palace, a daughter's suffering is less important than a king's ego. And this quiet moment of public betrayal, is where her story truly dies. Her name was Amytis, and what happened to her is one of the most disturbing examples of how absolute power destroys even the people it pretends to love. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, stay with me. This isn't just a story about a bad marriage. This is a forensic examination of 14 years of psychological torture, sanctioned by the state. This is how a princess of the Achaemenid Empire was erased while she was still breathing. You first have to understand the world she was born into, a world where one man's word could rearrange the fate of millions, where a whisper could level a city. Xerxes wasn't just a king. He was the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, ruling an empire so vast it stretched from the sands of Libya to the Indus Valley, from the cold mountains of Thrace to the steaming jungles of Ethiopia. Nearly 50 million people lived under his command, almost half the human population of Earth at that time. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who spoke to Persians serving in Xerxes' own court, his word was not advice, it was physics. A breath from his lips could save a nation or erase one. To refuse the king was to refuse the sun itself. But the true danger wasn't outside the palace walls, among the Spartans or the Ionians, but the Chi. It was inside. Because the Persian court wasn't a home, it was a fortress of silence. Imagine the palace of Susa. It is a masterpiece of intimidation. Walls of glazed brick, rising 50 feet high, depicting lions and griffins and the immortals, the king's elite guard, marching in eternal silence. To enter this world was to vanish from the real one. It was a sealed ecosystem guarded by eunuchs who owed everything to the king. No rumor escaped. No dissent survived. And everyone inside understood one terrifying truth. The closer you stood to absolute power, the easier it was to be crushed by it. Inside the palace, even the king's own blood lived under rules so rigid they controlled everything. Where they walked, who they could speak to, even the exact moments they were allowed to eat. Privacy didn't exist. Autonomy didn't exist. You were a prop in the king's theatre. And for the women of the royal house, especially the king's daughters, their lives were both elevated and terrifying. They were treasures of the empire, adored in ceremony, hidden in reality. They moved through the harem like ghosts draped in gold. They were educated in the arts, poetry, weaving, music, but they were illiterate in the language of freedom. Royal daughters weren't celebrated in public inscriptions. Most weren't even named in official records. They existed as political currency, bargaining chips, alliance tools, offerings wrapped in jewels. Amytis belonged to this world. But unlike many royal daughters who were dispatched to distant satrapies as children, she occupied a strange, favored position. She shared her name with Xerxes' principal wife, Amytis, a woman known in surviving texts for her fierce and sometimes merciless personality. But the younger Amytis was different. She was born to one of the king's secondary concubines, a woman of Bactrian blood. Even in a court where beauty was curated like an art form, her looks were noted as exceptional. She grew up in the women's quarters, the harem, educated by eunuchs and elder concubines. She learned the skills expected of a princess, how to dance without tiring, how to play the harp, how to embroider scenes of hunting and war. Sources hint at something unusual. Xerxes kept her close. While other daughters were married off to secure loyalty in Babylon or Egypt, Amytis remained in Susa. A father's affection in the Persian court may sound like protection. But here, in this pressure cooker of paranoia and power, it would prove to be the beginning of her downfall. Because to be loved by the king was to be noticed, and to be noticed was dangerous. Everything changed during a single banquet in 479 BC. The date is significant. It was the year after the disaster at Salamis, the year after the Persian navy was shattered by the Greeks. Xerxes had returned to Persia, his grand invasion of Europe a failure. He was a wounded god. His ego was bruised, his treasury drained, his immortality questioned. When a narcissist is wounded, they seek validation. They seek control. According to Greek and Persian accounts, though the details vary, the core of the story remains horrifyingly consistent. Xerxes threw a banquet to remind his court of his power. It was a display of excess designed to mask defeat. Picture the Great Hall of Susa. 36 columns of grey marble, each 60 feet high, supporting a roof of cedar brought from Lebanon. The floor is covered in carpets so thick they muffle the footsteps of slaves. The air is heavy with the smoke of roasting oxen and camels served whole. Wine flows like water, Shiraz wine, thick and sweet, served in golden rhyton shaped like lion heads. Xerxes sat on a high throne elevated above his guests. He had been drinking for days. He was surrounded by sycophants, flatterers feeding his sense of divinity. "You are the king of kings," they whispered. "Your will is the will of Ahura Mazda." In a moment of drunken bravado, perhaps trying to prove his generosity, perhaps trying to prove he was still the master of the world, he stood up. He swayed slightly. The hall went silent. He swore an oath by the Persian gods, by Mithra and Anahita. He raised his cup and declared that he would grant any request made to him by the guest of honor that night. This promise was catastrophic. In the ancient world, a king's oath was binding. To break it was to admit you were not a god, but a liar. And Xerxes, fragile and insecure, could not afford to be seen as a liar. Someone in the hall knew this. Artabanus. He was the commander of the Achaemenids, an aging general once loyal to Xerxes' father, Darius. He was over 60 years old, a relic of a previous age. He had already buried 3 wives. He was ambitious, cynical, and increasingly sidelined by younger commanders. He looked at the king, drunk and boastful. He looked at the court, terrified and silent, and he saw an opening. He understood the political value of tying himself to the royal lineage. If he married a daughter of the king, his bloodline would merge with the Achaemenids. He would be untouchable. So Artabanus rose. He walked to the foot of the throne. He bowed, his forehead touching the carpet, and he asked for what no one imagined he would dare request. He didn't ask for gold. He didn't ask for a province to govern. He didn't ask for a command in the army. He asked for the king's daughter. He asked for Amytis. A silence fell so thick it seemed to swallow the hall. Guests stared between the general and the king, fully aware of the audacity of the demand. Royal princesses almost never married ordinary subjects, even high-ranking generals. And when they did, it was to noble young princes, men of their own generation, not elderly men with liver spots on their hands, and the smell of old age clinging to their robes. Everyone waited for Xerxes to refuse. Everyone expected outrage. Everyone expected the king to order Artabanus dragged away for his insolence. Everyone was wrong. Herodotus describes the scene with chilling precision. King turned pale. He gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white. He glanced around the room like a trapped animal. He looked at his advisers, his eunuchs, his courtiers. He saw their eyes. They were waiting. If he refused, he broke his oath. If he broke his oath, he admitted his word was meaningless. And if his word was meaningless, his power was an illusion. Xerxes, the man who had whipped the sea for disobeying him, the man who had burned Athens, was trapped by his own vanity. Minutes passed. Long, suffocating minutes. Amytis, watching from the gallery or perhaps standing near the throne, must have felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage. She looked at her father. She willed him to speak, to laugh, to say no. Finally, Xerxes forced out a single word. His voice was flat, hollow. "Granted." And with that syllable, Amytis's fate was sealed. She wasn't the person anymore. She was a patch on the king's ego. According to later fragments and court gossip preserved by Greek historians, Amytis attempted to plead with her father. The banquet ended. The guests filtered out, whispering in the corridors. "You." The musicians packed away their instruments. In the private chambers of the palace, away from the eyes of the court, the tragedy played out in intimate detail. Amytis fell at her father's feet. She begged him. She cried. She reminded him of his love for her. She, trait, justing to round. She asked him to find a loophole, to offer Artabanus gold, land, 1,000 slaves, anything but her. But Xerxes was a man paralyzed by his own image. He was torn between genuine affection for his daughter and the desperate need to preserve the facade of a flawless ruler. He chose the image. He rationalized his decision through politics. That is what weak men do when they hold power. They call their cowardice strategy. He told himself that Artabanus, humiliated publicly, could become a dangerous enemy. If he refused the general now, Artabanus might conspire against him. Binding him through marriage would stabilize the court. It would ensure the loyalty of the Achaemenid regiments. That's what he told himself. The good of the state outweighs the life of a daughter. 3 months later, the marriage was carried out. It was a spectacle of imperial grandeur. Susa was draped in banners. Incense burned in every square. The dowry was immense. Chests of gold darics, herds of Nisian horses, estates in Babylon. But those who witnessed the ceremony remembered something else entirely. Beneath the silken jewels, worth more than entire cities, Amytis moved like a performer trained to conceal despair. Her face was painted with white lead and rouge, a mask of perfection. She walked through the ritual silently, her expression fixed somewhere between duty and dread. She didn't look at her groom. She didn't look at her father. Artabanus, meanwhile, radiated triumph. He stood at the altar, a man in the winter of his life claiming a prize of spring. He had secured not only a young and beautiful wife, but a permanent, intimate tie to the Achaemenid bloodline. He had won the Game of Thrones. As the ceremony ended, and the heavy doors of the bridal chamber closed, shutting out the music and the cheers, the true consequences of Xerxes' decision began to unfold. The banquet was over. The guests went home. Xerxes went back to his wine. And Amytis was left alone in the dark with the man she feared, a man who owned her because her father had sold her for a round of applause. This was not a marriage. It was a sentence. And the sentence was just beginning. The wedding ended. The guests went home. The heavy doors of Artabanus's estate were bolted shut. Inside, the silence was immediate. Amytis stood in the center of a room she had never seen before. It smelled of old cedar and lamp oil. She was 14. Her husband was 62. And when the servants stripped away the heavy wedding robes, the reality of the transaction became unavoidable. Artabanus did not look like the general who had commanded armies. Without his armor, without the distance of the banquet hall, he was just an old man. His skin was loose and spotted with age. His hands, which now reached for her, shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with nerves. There was no seduction. Artabanus didn't waste time on words. He viewed this night as a medical necessity, a procedure to secure an heir. For Amytis, it was a blur of confusion and sharp sudden pain. She learned that night that being a princess offered no shield against the indignities of the body. When he was finished, he rolled over and slept. She lay awake, listening to the wheezing breath of the man who now owned her, staring at a ceiling painted with hunting scenes. The next morning, the cage became visible. Artabanus began systematically dismantling her identity. He knew that a Persian princess's power lay in her connections, her access to the harem, her ability to whisper to her mother, the eunuchs who carried messages. He cut the lines. He dismissed the maids she had brought from the palace. He replaced them with Achaemenid women from his own lands, older women with hard faces who spoke a dialect Amytis barely understood. They didn't speak to her, they watched her. She was forbidden to leave the inner courtyard. It was a cruel geography. From her window, she could actually see the roof of her father's palace. It was less than 500 yards away. She could see the smoke rising from the kitchens where her meals used to be prepared. She could hear the faint sound of trumpets marking the changing of the guards who answered to her father. She was right there, and she was completely unreachable. The days bled into one another. Boredom became a physical weight. Amytis spent hours embroidering, pushing the needle through silk until her fingers were raw, just to have something to do with her hands. But Artabanus was impatient. He hadn't married her for her needlework. He married her for a son. When the first month passed without a pregnancy, his mood darkened. He didn't blame nature, he blamed her. He brought in physicians. These weren't the royal doctors she was used to. These were men who smelled of sour wine and dried blood. They poked her. They examined her like livestock. They forced her to drink thick, bitter draughts of crushed herbs meant to heat the womb. She drank them because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. She tried to get a message out. One afternoon, she found a young stable boy delivering wood to the women's quarters. He looked terrified, eyes fixed on the ground. Amytis took a gold bracelet from her wrist. Heavy, intricate work, worth enough to feed the boy's family for a lifetime. She slid it across the table. She didn't write a letter. Letters could be intercepted and read. She gave him a verbal message, 3 words to carry to the chief eunuch of the king, "I am afraid." She waited. For a week, every time the heavy door creaked open, her heart hammered against her ribs. She waited for her father's guards to march in. She waited for a summons to the palace. Nothing came. The boy never returned. Perhaps he took the gold and ran. Perhaps Artabanus caught him. Or perhaps the message was delivered, and Xerxes simply waved it away. That silence broke something in her. It was the realization that she hadn't been forgotten. She had been discarded. 3 years passed. 3 years of the bitter herbs. 3 years of the old man's weight. Then, in 460 BC, the sickness started. She missed her bleed. Her body swelled. Artabanus was ecstatic. He strutted through the court, accepting congratulations. He ordered sacrifices. He treated Amytis not with affection, but with the protectiveness one shows a valuable broodmare. He monitored her food. He restricted her movement even further. Amytis felt like she was carrying a parasite. She knew the law. If she gave birth to a royal child, she was tied to this house forever. There would be no divorce, no return to the palace. The child was the lock and the birth would throw away the key. She stopped speaking. She spent her days sitting in the shade of the courtyard, staring at nothing. The servants whispered that she looked like a ghost haunting her own life. The labor was brutal. It lasted 2 days. The midwives were terrified. Artabanus paced outside the door, shouting threats. If the baby died, he promised heads would roll. Door 8. Finally, a boy was born. He was small. His skin was grey. He didn't cry immediately. Artabanus didn't care. He rushed in, ignoring the blood and the exhausted girl on the bed. He snatched up the child. He named him Xerxes on the spot. He saw a dynasty. Amytis turned her face to the wall. She didn't want to hold him. 10 days later, the nursery was silent. The baby died in the night. The physicians said his lungs were too weak. It happened all the time. But Artabanus didn't accept it. Après ni you and her. His grief turned instantly into violence. He stormed into Amytis's room. He smelled of wine and fury. He accused her of neglect. He accused her of starving the boy. He screamed that her weak blood had poisoned his air. Then, for the first time, he hit her. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist. It knocked her off the bed. Amytis lay on the floor, tasting blood in her mouth. She looked up at him. This was a capital crime. To strike royal blood was death. But Artabanus stood over her, breathing hard, and he didn't look afraid. He looked empowered. He realized then what she already knew. Xerxes wasn't coming. The guards weren't coming. He could do whatever he wanted. The next day, she didn't leave her room. The bruise on her face turned from purple to yellow. She sat by the window, watching the smoke rise from her father's palace, listening to the distant music of the court. She didn't cry. She just watched. The girl who had walked into the banquet hall 3 years ago was gone. What was left was something harder, something colder, and she was entirely alone. 14 years passed. The girl who had been sold at the banquet was gone. Amytis was 28 years old, but the woman who looked back from the polished bronze mirror seemed twice that age. Her hair, once the envy of the court, was streaked with premature grey. Her skin was pale, untouched by the sun she was rarely allowed to see. There were lines around her mouth, not from smiling, but from the constant tension of keeping her jaw clenched. She lived in a state of suspended animation. She moved through Artabanus's estate like a sleepwalker. The beatings had become less frequent, not because he had grown kind, but because she had ceased to resist. She was a broken horse. There was no sport in whipping an animal that no longer flinched. But outside her walls, the empire was rotting. Xerxes had retreated into his harem. The defeat in Greece had broken his spirit. He spent his days building monuments to himself and his nights drinking until he passed out. The administration of the state fell to his subordinates. Chief among them was Artabanus. The old general had consolidated power with the patience of a spider. He controlled the royal guard. He controlled the flow of information. He controlled the king's daughter. He began to see himself not as a servant, but as the true ruler of Persia. Amytis saw the change in him. She saw the way he spoke to the messengers. She saw the late-night meetings with the chief eunuch, Aspitras. She smelled the ambition on him. It smelled like iron. August 1405 BC. The heat in Susa was oppressive. The air hung still and heavy, thick with dust. On a night when the moon was hidden by clouds, Artabanus did not come to her bed. He dressed in his official court robes. He strapped a short sword and a kinax beneath his tunic. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. The silence in the house was different that night. That night it was the silence of a held breath. He left the estate and walked the short distance to the palace. The guards at the gate were his men. They let him pass. He walked through the familiar corridors, past the reliefs of lions and bulls, to the royal bedchamber. Xerxes was asleep. He was 54 years old, bloated from wine and excess. There were no guards at the door. Artabanus had dismissed them. The murder was not glorious. It was a messy, quiet piece of butchery. Artabanus and the eunuch Achaemenid entered the room. They didn't wake the king. They simply stabbed him. The king of kings, the man who had burned Athens, the man who had sold his daughter for a cheer, died in his underwear, choking on his own blood. Artabanus returned home before dawn. He entered Amytis's room. He was still wearing the same tunic. There were dark, wet splatters on the silk. He woke her up. He stood over her bed holding a lamp. The light cast deep shadows on his face. "Your father is dead," he said. He didn't say I killed him. Impressible. He didn't have to. Amytis looked at the blood on his chest. She looked at his face. She felt nothing. No grief. No shock. The father she loved had died 14 years ago in the banquet hall. This was just the death of the stranger who had taken his place. Good, she whispered. Or perhaps she didn't say it. Perhaps she just thought it. Artabanus turned and left to secure the throne. The next 7 months were a blur of political chaos. Artabanus did not declare himself king immediately. He was too cunning for that. He went to Xerxes' eldest son Darius and accused the younger brother Artaxerxes of the murder. In a blind rage, Darius ordered Artaxerxes executed. Or, according to some sources, Artabanus tricked Artaxerxes into killing Darius. The result was the same. The royal family tore itself apart. Blood filled the palace gutters. And standing amidst the wreckage was Artabanus, the regent, the hand behind the throne. For 7 months, Amytis was effectively the queen of Persia. Artabanus moved her back into the palace. He paraded her at court functions. He wanted the nobles to see her. She was his legitimacy. She was the living proof of his connection to the Achaemenid bloodline. She stood by his side as the nobles bowed. The same nobles who had applauded her sale, now applauded her husband's usurpation. She wore the jewels he gave her. She sat where he told her to sit. But her eyes were dead. But she realized the ultimate, cruel irony of her life. Her father had sacrificed her to buy Artabanus's loyalty. And that sacrifice had bought nothing. It hadn't saved Xerxes. It had simply given his killer the keys to the bedroom. She was the bridge Artabanus had walked across to kill her family. But Artabanus had made a mistake. He had underestimated the younger son. Artaxerxes was young, barely 20, but he wasn't stupid. He began to see the cracks in the story. He saw how the guards looked at Artabanus. He saw the way the old general sat on the throne when he thought no one was looking. And perhaps he saw his sister. He saw the bruises she tried to hide with powder. He saw the terror in her posture when Artabanus raised a hand. The end came in the throne room. It was a confrontation that turned physical. Artabanus, arrogant in his power, tried to strike the young prince with a dagger. But Artaxerxes was young, strong, and fighting for his life. He drew his sword. The fight was short. Picture. Artaxerxes drove his blade through Artabanus's chest. The armor the old general wore under his robes failed him. He fell to the polished stone floor, gasping. The blood spread out around him, mirroring the blood of Xerxes he had shed months earlier. The guards stood back. They knew a regime change when they saw one. They lowered their spears. Amytis was in the room. She watched her husband die. She watched the light go out of the eyes that had watched her with such contempt for 14 years. She watched the hands that had beaten her go slack. She waited for the feeling of relief. She waited for the joy of liberation, but it didn't come. She just felt cold. The monster was dead. But the cage was still there. It was inside her head now. Artaxerxes, panting, covered in sweat and blood, looked at his sister. He was her half-brother. He remembered her from before. He remembered the laughing girl in the gardens. He walked over to her. He expected gratitude. He expected her to weep with joy. "You are free," he said. Amytis looked at him. She looked at the corpse of her husband. She looked at the throne where her father used to sit. She didn't recognize any of them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her voice, unused for so long, had withered. She simply turned and walked out of the throne room, leaving the men to clean up the blood. She returned to her old rooms in the harem. Free, the servants tried to attend to her. They brought her food. They brought her fresh clothes. They opened the windows to let in the sunlight. Artaxerxes tried to make amends. He restored her status. He gave her estates. He executed Artabanus' sons, the children of his other wives, to ensure Amytis was safe. He treated her with the reverence due a royal princess who had survived a nightmare. But the damage was structural. You can rebuild a wall, but you cannot unbreak a vase. Amytis refused to leave her quarters. She refused to attend the victory celebration. She sat in the corner of her room, rocking back and forth. When the musicians played in the courtyard, she covered her ears. The music reminded her of the banquet. When the sun set, she began to shake. Her body remembered the rhythm of the abuse, even if the abuser was dead. She was 29 years old. She was the sister of the king. She was the richest woman in the empire. And she was completely, irrevocably destroyed. The physicians came. They prescribed rest. They prescribed wine. They didn't understand. They were treating a body, but the sickness was in the history. She had been taught one lesson by the two most powerful men in the world, that she did not exist. Xerxes had erased her will. Artabanus had erased her dignity. Now, left alone with the wreckage, she didn't know how to be a person anymore. One evening, a few months after the coup, a servant found her standing by the window, staring at the setting sun. She was speaking softly to herself. The servant moved closer to listen. Amytis wasn't speaking to the gods. She wasn't speaking to her brother. She was speaking to the baby who had died 10 years ago. "And because 10 years ago, it is safe now," she whispered. "You can come back. The bad man is gone." "Why?" She waited for an answer. But the room, as always, remained silent. Peace returned to Susa. Under Artaxerxes, the empire stabilized. The blood was scrubbed from the throne room floor. The heads of Artabanus and his sons were mounted on spikes at the city gates, turning slowly to leather in the sun. The court resumed its rhythms of feasts, hunts, and taxes. But in the royal harem, in a suite of rooms facing the eastern gardens, time had stopped. Amytis was 29 years old. She was physically free. Her brother was the king of kings, and he treated her with a guilty, clumsy tenderness. He restored her titles. He showered her with gold. He assigned 20 servants to attend to her every whim. But freedom is a terrifying thing to a creature that has been caged too long. When the door to the cage is opened, the bird doesn't always fly. Sometimes it retreats to the back corner and shivers. Amytis did not re-enter society. She refused invitations to the royal table. She refused to wear the heavy jewelry that reminded her of her wedding day. She spent her days sitting in a chair by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. The servants whispered that she was aging at an unnatural speed. Her hair, once black as a raven's wing, turned entirely white within a year of her husband's death. Her skin became translucent, stretched tight over her cheekbones. She looked like a woman of 50. She rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was a rasp, unused and brittle. Artaxerxes tried to reach her. He would come to her rooms in the evenings, still wearing his court robes, smelling of power and incense. He would sit with her. He would talk about the affairs of the state, about the harvest in Babylon, about the new lions in the royal park. He wanted her to be the sister he remembered. He wanted absolution. If she recovered, it meant the nightmare was over. It meant the house of Xerxes had survived. But Amytis would just look at him. She didn't see a brother. She saw a man. And in her world, men were architects of pain. One evening, Artaxerxes brought a gift, a necklace of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. "It matches your eyes," he said, smiling. Amytis touched the cold stones. Her hand trembled. "It matches the bruise," she whispered. Artaxerxes stopped smiling. He left the room and didn't come back for a month. The psychological collapse wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone. First, she stopped sleeping. The nights were too quiet. In the silence, she could hear Artabanus's heavy tread in the hallway, even though he was dead. She could hear the breathing of her lost baby. She began to pace. Servants reported that she walked the length of her room for hours, back and forth, thousands of times a night. until her feet were blistered. Then she stopped enduring music. Music was the trigger. It was the thread that pulled her back to the banquet hall. In 49 BC, one afternoon, Xerxes sent a troupe of musicians to the harem to lift the spirits of the women. They set up in the courtyard below Amytis's window. They began to play a traditional Persian melody, a song of celebration. It was the same song. The same melody the flutes had played when Xerxes stood up to speak. The same rhythm that had covered the sound of her life being sold. The reaction was immediate and violent. Amytis, who had moved like a ghost for months, suddenly screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a wounded animal tearing itself out of a trap. She ran to the window. She grabbed a heavy bronze vase and hurled it into the courtyard. It shattered on the stones below, silencing the music. She fell to her knees, clawing at her ears, screaming for them to stop. He is speaking. Wist to sage, complexion to speaking. With thirst to bang is a verster to spendy. She shrieked. Make him stop speaking. She wasn't hearing the music. She was hearing her father's voice. Granted. 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 The servants rushed in. They found her huddled in the corner, rocking, bleeding where she had scratched her own face. They sedated her with opium. The music was forbidden near her rooms from that day on. After the incident, the decline accelerated. Amytis began to refuse food. It wasn't a dramatic hunger strike. It was a simple lack of will. Eating required effort. Men are paid, will are paid. Will, it required a desire to sustain life, and Amytis had no such desire. She ate only when the servants coaxed her, spoonful by spoonful, like a child. She grew thinner. Her eyes seemed to swallow her face. She was fading. She was erasing herself. The physicians were helpless. They treated the symptoms. They prescribed tonics for the blood, salves for the skin. They debated the balance of her humors, but they couldn't treat the cause. The cause was history. The cause was a father who valued his reputation more than his child. The cause was a husband who valued his legacy more than his wife. Amytis was dying of a broken reality. She had looked into the heart of absolute power and seen that it had no love in it. 7 years passed in this twilight. 7 years of the white-haired woman in the window. By 457 BC she was bedridden. She was 36 years old. The end, when it came, was anticlimactic. There were no final words, no dramatic reconciliations. She simply didn't wake up one morning. The servant who found her said she looked peaceful. For the first time in 20 years, her jaw was unclenched. Her hands were open. The tension that had held her together since she was 14 had finally snapped. Xerxes ordered a state funeral. It was grand. It was loud. Professional mourners tore their clothes. Incense burned in clouds. The court wore white, the color of Persian mourning. They buried her in the royal tomb complex at Xerxes. But there was no inscription for her. The Achaemenid kings did not record the tragedies of their daughters. They recorded victories. They recorded the nations they conquered, the temples they built, the rebels they crushed. Amytis was not a victory. She was a stain. She was a reminder of the rot at the center of the empire. So she was buried in silence. Her name was omitted from the stone. History moved on. Artaxerxes ruled for 40 years. The empire rose and fell. Alexander came and burned Persepolis. The sands of the desert covered Susa. Herodotus, the Greek historian, picked up the fragments of her story from Persian exiles. He wrote it down not as a tragedy but as a footnote in the history of Xerxes' reign. For centuries she was just a name in a dusty scroll. But look closer at the fragments. Look at the administrative tablets from Artabanus's estate. Look at the gaps in the royal record. The story of Amytis is not just an ancient anecdote. It is a forensic blueprint of abuse. It shows us exactly how power works when it is stripped of conscience. Xerxes did not strike his daughter. He did not lock her in a room. He didn't have to. He simply treated her as an object. He prioritized his political image over her humanity. And that decision, made in a split second of drunken vanity, destroyed a human being as thoroughly as a sword through the chest. The most disturbing part of Amytis's story isn't the physical violence of Artabanus. It is the silence of Xerxes. It is the father who listens to his daughter beg and chooses to look away because it is inconvenient to look at her. It is the realization that the people who are supposed to protect us, fathers, kings, leaders, are often the ones who sell us to the wolves to save themselves. Amytis died 2,500 years ago. Her bones are dust. Her tomb is empty. But the room she lived in, the room where the door is locked, where the voice doesn't reach the outside world, where the victim waits for a rescue that never comes, that room still exists. It exists in every house where authority is used to silence the vulnerable. She was the first casualty of the king's ego. She was the collateral damage of a great man of history. And in the end, her life was the price of his legend.